if you know that somebody is visual, then showing them things and even using visual language is going to be more effective. So put that over here for a second, and then I'll kind of explain the other two, and then I'll talk about examples. So that's visual, seeing. The second one is kinesthetic. So, oh, and by the way, there are 55% of people on average on, if you look at the population as a whole, 55% of people, visual is their primary language. So we know that the majority of people, visual is their number one. Now, the second group is kinesthetic. These are people who it's by feel. They learn best by actually doing. You can explain it to them, you can show diagrams, but until they get in and start tinkering with it and doing it themselves, they have to be engaged in doing. And it doesn't even have to be physically with their hands, but that, in the more pure sense, that is how they're going to learn best, is doing it. But it somehow they have to feel it. It has to be something that they actively experience, that just seeing it or hearing about it is not the same. They learn by doing, by touch, by feeling. And 30% of people are kinesthetic. And then the last category is auditory, and 15% of the population are primarily auditory. Now, the reason this is obviously important is if we're talking to people the majority of the time on the phone, and 85% of people, auditory is not their primary way to learn. So knowing that, we have to sometimes compensate for it. There are people, if you've ever noticed, there are people you could just say something to them once and they pick it up, they hear it. There are other people you could read a question to them and read the multiple choice answers, and they have no problem answering based on hearing you read the question and give them the multiple choice. There are other people that would be like, okay, let me see that. And they need to, with their own eyes, they need to read the question and see the answers. And then it's easy for them to say, oh, well, the answer is B. How many of you have ever noticed this in yourselves, and that you need to see it, or that you can hear it and it's fine, or some people can, but you can't. So we all have kind of these strengths and weaknesses. And again, it's not all or nothing. Everybody has some of all three. It's just there's a more comfortable, natural way. And since only 15% their primary way is auditory, it's one of the reasons why clearly if we can move towards more Zoom calls at some point, that's going to help with a large chunk of the population will feel better when they see you and when you're showing them things instead of just telling them things. But just for what it's worth, the closing percentages and all the results that we've talked about were 99% just phone and 1% Zoom calls. So none of those results depended on being on a Zoom call. We did notice the very few that happened on Zoom, provided that we were prepared and competent at doing it on a Zoom, the results got even better. So it's an opportunity, but it's not necessarily going to be an obstacle to say, oh, well, if only we were in Zoom, because people are visual. So aside from the obvious of showing people and making it physically visual, that they can see it, there's also the language that people use to describe things, to explain things. So a visual person, you might ask, what do you see yourself using that money for? An auditory person, you're more likely to respond to them and say, okay, I hear what you're saying. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like, and you're just using words that make them feel more comfortable by talking about it in an auditory way or talking about it in a visual way. I can see when you're again, it applies to anything, but if they were talking about going on that vacation, I would be more likely to get excited for them about, oh my gosh, that vacation, can't you just see yourself? And then, go on about describing briefly what that vacation would look like. If I know that they're kinesthetic, it's their toes in the sand and the sun on their face and, oh my gosh, the waves crashing on it. Those kinds of descriptions are going to have more impact on the kinesthetic. You could talk about how beautiful it is and what it looks like, and it's not going to have the same effect. And auditory, it might be the sound of the waves, and it might be, other ways that you describe what it would sound like. But the hard part for most people is, the part that takes more time and practice, is learning whether somebody is visual, kinesthetic, or auditory. Because especially on the phone, it's harder to figure that out. When you see people in person, it's dramatically easier to decide if they're visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. There's clues in how they dress. There's clues in how they do their makeup or their hair, or, you know, there's things that you can pick up about a person who's more of a visual and a person who's more of a kinesthetic. And if you don't have the advantage of seeing them and you don't have all those clues, it's a little harder. You're going to be listening to how they say things. Also, their rate of speech is a little bit of a clue, which we'll talk a little bit about. But visual people tend to talk faster, and kinesthetic people tend to talk the slowest. They're kind of feeling their way through processing a thought and verbalizing what's in their mind. An auditory person is usually somewhere in the middle, but an auditory person is generally going to be more tuned into sounding good. They're well spoken. They're saying things in a way that it's easier to listen to. Whereas the kinesthetic person, it might be kind of rough, but you get what they're saying, but they're kind of bumping their way through it. And the visual person, sometimes they just can't even keep up with the thoughts, and they're just talking so fast you're trying to keep up. So there are ways to kind of tell. My point of this is, since we don't have the time to practice and master telling whether somebody's visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, you do want to be aware of it. Remember the awareness test where you weren't looking for the person in the gorilla costume moonwalking, but once you knew it was there, you at least saw it. It was easy to catch that because you're looking for it. So we want to be aware of it. And then the most important thing that we can do is incorporating some of all three into the ways that we say things and describe things, so nobody gets left behind. And then if you're in the course of talking to people and you start to pick up on, hey, every time I say something to them, no matter what way I say it, they say something back that's just all visual, then maybe I would start to move more towards using, speaking their language. I would say things the way I hear them saying things. And so you kind of mirror their primary language. But again, the main takeaway, the 60-second learning version of it, if you don't have time to master all that other stuff, is just to be aware that people speak different languages and to incorporate enough of all three so that nobody gets left behind. So if you watch marketing, well done marketing copy or commercials and things, they try to incorporate all these elements. They're not like, okay, this is the commercial for the visual people. They know 55% are visual, so visual is going to be heavily relied on, but they're trying to incorporate those other aspects for the people who aren't really as moved by the visual. So they incorporate the feeling, they incorporate the sound, and they try and get everybody. So you want to try and do a little bit of something for everybody.